You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
You're watching West Hartford Community Television.
For the community, by the community.
Hello, I'm Christine Beck. I'm the Poet Laureate of West Hartford, and I'm welcoming you back to a series called Poetry Around the Town. This is a series in which I interview different people who are involved in poetry and in promoting the enjoyment and the reading of poetry. Before I talk about our guest for today, I want to let you know that you can go and see any of the prior interviews that I have done at West Hartford Community TV. You would go to whctv.org, you would go to Video on Demand, and then click on Poetry Around the Town. I've conducted interviews with some prior Poets Laureate from West Hartford, including Ginny Connors, who is, in addition to being a prior West Hartford Poet Laureate, the head of a coalition of various different Poets Laureate around the state of Connecticut. So there are some, I think, between 15 and 20 of us now. We often get together and do joint readings at different events, and it's been a privilege to get to know some of the different poets from all around the state who are involved in spreading the joy of poetry. So I've also talked to Maria Sassi. She was the first Poet Laureate here in West Hartford, and to Jim Finnegan, who also preceded me as a West Hartford Poet Laureate. And I just want to say, before I go any further, that all three of those people that I've interviewed didn't stop when their term as Poet Laureate ended. Jim Finnegan runs a series called Word Forge. It's typically the first Monday of the month at Billings Forge on Broad Street in Hartford. It's a reading series and an open mic, so please check that out. Ginny Connors is extremely active in the poetry community. As I said, she is the head of this coalition of state poets laureate in Connecticut. And Maria Sassi runs a series at the Noah Webster House, which is a very famous historical house here in West Hartford. So twice a year, she finds readers and has them come and read their work. In addition to that, there is always an open mic. So I make the offer again to any of you who have poems that you have in the drawer or that you think aren't ready for prime time. Really, I heartily invite you to come to one of these events where there is an open mic and read a poem. Share your work with the rest of us. You will find that we are an admiring crowd, and we're always happy to share our work with you and to hear what you have to write as well. So this evening I have the privilege of talking a bit with a woman named Katie Irish. I came across Katie, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago when I had the privilege of doing a reading on a series called Poetry on the Porch. So welcome, Katie. Happy to have you talking a little bit about your work in poetry. And I hope you'll tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Poetry on the Porch.
Oh, Christine, thank you so much. I commend you doing this as part of your term as Poet Laureate, making poetry accessible to everyone. That's very important. And I started a series, the West End Poetry Series. Christine, as she said, read in my series. It is a monthly series in the West End of Hartford. We have our spring series starting this coming Saturday, and it's fantastic. I also am a freelance writer. I do some fundraising work, and I try to get involved in as much poetry as I can. I'm attending the Poetry by the Sea conference next week. Kim Bridgeford, another fantastic poet who I was fortunate to have read in my series, presents this fantastic event annually. So there's a lot of poetic conferences and whatnot going on in the state of Connecticut. So should you be interested, all you have to do is take a look around, and it's around.
So I want to ask you something about the name of your series because it's unusual. Sometimes it's called Poetry on the Patio, and sometimes it's called Poetry in the Parlor. So, why?
It's actually never called Poetry in the Patio. That's
The porch, sorry.
That's a series that's in West Hartford. It's another fantastic summer series that is run in West Hartford. It is actually the West End Poetry Society. And under the West End Poetry Society, we have Poetry in the Parlor in the winter months and Poetry on the Porch in the summer and spring months. And it's just a way for the community to get together and enjoy poetry.
Very nice. Now, if we wanted to find out when your events are or more information about how to attend your events, where would we go? What would we look for?
Absolutely. Our website is still in the works, so the best way to contact would be to email me, poetryontheporch@gmail.com.
Perfect. And you also have, I know you do some emails out, so if folks give you their email address, you can put them on your list, your distribution list.
Yes, I do send about once a month, sometimes a little bit more. I'd be happy to add your email to my list so you'll know when the next events are, who is reading. So feel free to send an email, poetryontheporch@gmail.com.
Now I want to ask another important question. How did you get involved in this to begin with? You were minding your own business, and then suddenly you fell into the hole called poetry organizing. Yes?
I've always written poetry. Somebody asked me recently, when did I start writing?
Mm-hmm.
I think I can remember probably the 3rd grade. I had a fabulous teacher, and I remember writing stories for this particular teacher. He was fantastic. So I continued to write, and probably in high school I started writing poetry, and I've written poetry ever since. This series, when I started living in Hartford, I live in the West End, so it's not, very close to where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
I would walk in my neighborhood, and I would see these beautiful porches, and I would think, why isn't anyone reading poetry on the porch? I used to do that. I really did. My mom had a beautiful Victorian house, and I read poetry on the porch. And I thought it would be a really fantastic idea. The first time I did this, I was at a beautiful farmhouse on Kenyon Street, and I didn't do a whole lot of advertising. I thought people will just want to come and read their own poems on the porch. It ended up being me and the darling homeowner. We just had dinner together. No one wanted to read any poetry. And I said, I need a headline poet. So I was fortunate to ask Rennie McQuilkin. He said yes, and that week prior to his reading is when it was announced that he was Connecticut's Poet Laureate. So the season started off.
Wonderful coincidence.
Yeah, it was grand. It was really fantastic.
And you have gotten some incredible poets to come and read in this series. I think one of the wonderful things about you, Katie, is you're just perfectly happy to ask people and see what they say. And some remarkable people say yes, people I wouldn't even ask. So congratulations, something you're doing is working wonderfully.
Thank you.
And we're all the beneficiaries of it, which is terrific.
Thank you. I think that comes from fundraising.
Okay.
My background
Tell me
in
about
fundraising, I worked at Cornell in fundraising. I'm accustomed to hearing no. So I knew that I couldn't stop if someone said no. So I just asked. I asked some pretty big name people that I won't even, now I realize what I did. I was very fortunate this season because we have mutual friends that are really fantastic poets. So this season was pretty much all of my poetry friends, every single one. So I either need to make some new poetry friends, or hopefully one of these grants will come through so I can pay the poets an honorarium that they deserve. So we'll see what happens.
And I think your point is very well taken. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that most of these events, poets are showing up and they are reading their poetry, and they're not being paid a penny to do it. And it really is a sad state of events as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of people who think poetry ought to be free. And yet you have people who are, giving up their time and traveling and showing up and reading their work. And we're both really hopeful that the day will come when, poets can be paid appropriately. Maybe not as much as, a Hillary Clinton who, appears before the State Department, but,
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. It is definitely, funding for the arts in general is something, funding in Connecticut is just a difficult time right now for that. So, but certainly it is something for people to think about when they attend these series, and we say donations are appreciated, to dig out of your pocket $1 or $2. It really does make a difference.
Right.
So yeah, just
So,
something to
thank
keep
you
in
for what you
mind.
do.
Oh,
And you're also starting a
absolutely.
blog now.
Yes,
Yeah?
I do. I do have a blog.
So tell us about that.
As part of the West End Poetry Series, and it's just a way for me to kind of say what's going on, send some pictures out. It's fun. I like doing blog work. So again, if you send me, well, I guess actually this is just on WordPress, so it wouldn't be something I could email. So it's
Well,
wonderful
we'll look
to do.
for it. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
we'll look to find that
Yes,
out.
we're on Facebook, so.
Excellent.
Yes.
So today I wanted to talk with you a little bit about some poems that I love, and kind of illustrate a little bit what we do in the series that I'm running at the Hartford Public Library, which is called Poets on Poetry, which shortens to POP. And Katie and I had a conversation because Poetry in the Parlor also shortens to POP, so we had to think about who gets POP first. But we're not worrying about that right now. Anyway. One of the wonderful things about this series is I ask a poet to come in and talk about another poet's work. And so the people that come to the Hartford Public Library, some of them are writers, but many of them are also people who are simply interested in poetry and want to learn more about well-known poets. So the one that will be running in the month of June is going to be on Edna St. Vincent Millay. Then we're going to take a hiatus, and we'll be back in September. And in September, we will be doing Lucille Clifton and Yeats and some other really interesting poets. So it's a wonderful series, and you can contact me through my website, which is www.christinebeck.net, and I'll be happy to put you on my distribution list for the Poets on Poetry series at the Hartford Public Library. So, Katie, the poem that I wanted to talk about first today is a poem written by Jane Kenyon. Actually, I've read one of Jane Kenyon's poems here earlier called Let Evening Come. And we're going to show this poem to you, our viewers, while Katie reads it, so you can actually see it on the page. And then we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about it. So would you read the poem?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Sure. In the nursing home. She is like a horse grazing a hill pasture that someone makes smaller by coming every night to pull the fences in and in. She has stopped running wide loops, stopped even the tight circles. She drops her head to feed, grass is dust, and the creek bed's dry. Master, come with your light halter. Come and bring her in.
Thank you. That's a lovely reading. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this poem is to look at the poem itself and ask what is literally going on in the poem, disregarding for the moment the title. What would you say?
It's a somber poem. It's a short, somber poem. You feel sadness when you read this poem.
Yeah. And it appears to be basically a poem about a horse, right? It says she is like a horse. So there's some she, and we don't know much about the she, right?
That is correct. You could make the assumption that it's a female horse, but you can look into this poem and see that it could be a little something different too. It could have a double meaning, such as the word master has a specific double meaning. As when you read it, you could think of it as a higher being, master, come with your light, but it also could be the master of, say, the horse stable.
Yes. So basically, what the picture that I'm getting, and the word imagery in poetry essentially means a scene or a picture that's been painted for us with words. And so what Jane Kenyon has done, I think, quite brilliantly is she's drawn for us an old horse, right? A horse that some force is making the fences move in, and of course that's not actually happening. That's a feeling of what's happening, and then she goes on to say this horse has stopped running wide loops, stopped even the tight circles, and so for me that sense of motion in the poem, the horse's motion that's slowing down is a metaphor for this person who is, we assume, in the nursing home. Yes, because that's the title?
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the things that Jane Kenyon is really very well known for, being able to draw from the natural world very clear and specific imagery. And so the poem is asking us to first appreciate the imagery about an old horse, yeah? An old horse presumably being brought in. I think of the horse as being brought in to the barn. And so when the poet says, "Master, come with your light halter, come and bring her in," we talked about the craft that the poet has used in that enjambment in those last two lines. So for you, our listeners, you may recall, if you've seen some of the earlier series, we've talked about the fact that an enjambment is a word at the end of a line that doesn't actually end the syntax or the sentence or the phrase. You have to continue on to the beginning of the next line to finish the phrase. So why would a poet do that? Why wouldn't she simply have put a halter at the end of that line, that second to the last line? And my feeling is because she wants a little bit of a resonance with "come with your light, come with your light." So I see an image of the master with a light held high in a lantern. And so we don't get that it's actually a light halter until we get to the beginning of that last line. So what I was saying earlier, Katie, is my guess is that Jane Kenyon played with those last two lines for a long time before she got it to say exactly what she wanted it to say.
Exactly, because the way that she has the words light and halter starting the last sentence, it's something that just doesn't come with, you have to kind of play with the poem itself a little bit.
Yeah. And of course, Jane Kenyon has also done something that I find to be really one of the important tools in the poet's toolbox, and that is the title. So we don't get necessarily that this is a metaphor until we read the title, In the Nursing Home. And then, and she isn't hiding that from us. She's telling us at the very beginning, I'm going to write you a poem and I'm going to ask you to appreciate it on the level of thinking about the old horse, but also thinking about how the she, who is presumably in the nursing home, is like a horse grazing. So that's a simile. It's at the very first line. You know, and I often have younger poets in my classes wanting to surprise me at the end of a poem. There's nothing wrong with surprise as long as it works, as long as it helps the poem deliver its work and its meaning. What I find brilliant here is that Jane Kenyon is willing to give us the title and then let us fill in the rest. Yeah?
There's no giant surprise. When you read the title, In the Nursing Home, you know that you're not going to a party. You know that it's going to be a somber poem. So she does surprise you by talking about a horse. You're thinking, what horse is in a nursing home? But as you read the poem, talking about the wide loops are now tight circles, you have an understanding of what she's saying.
Yeah. And yet, even though we have a lot of word choice like the grass is dust, which evokes kind of ashes to ashes, dust to dust to me, the creek bed's dry, those final two lines, it strikes me, are extremely hopeful. And Jane Kenyon is known for an underlying sense of spirituality in her poems. She was a very spirit-filled woman. I think only a poet at her level would use a word like master and get away with it.
Absolutely.
And so I really admire that in her work. I admire that bold stroke.
Sure.
You know, master. It's right there. So I'm going to read another poem by Dick Allen, who is the former Connecticut State Poet Laureate. And it's from his book called This Shadowy Place. And it illustrates, I think, a completely different aspect of poetry that I so enjoy. It's called Because a Blue Heron Flew Overhead. Because a blue heron flew overhead, it was a good day to butter bread, to listen to James Taylor, Stockbridge to Boston, and visit the garden of the unsuccessful politician. A good day to ask a clock what makes it tick, or place one brick on another brick. To remember that if you think there are ripples, but also if you don't think there are ripples. And because a blue heron flew overhead, we swept up the porch, we made up the bed. We bought packaged shirts, then took out their pins. We placed gray umbrellas in clear storage bins. There was a road, a lake, a moonlit field, a brow to be soothed, a wound to be healed. Stockbridge to Boston, sweet baby James, the glory, the wonder, the sheer joy of names. And my life was a story of thread and unthread, because a blue heron flew overhead. So the first thing that I noticed about this poem is it's a rhyming poem, which Jane Kenyon's was not. And as we said a little bit earlier, it almost reminds me of Dr. Seuss. No?
It does. It does. The first line, we're talking about a blue heron, and then we're talking about buttering bread, which is something that I could see Dr. Seuss writing about.
Yes, and so that's that issue with Dr. Seuss of things that don't quite go together,
Correct.
right? Thing like green eggs and ham.
Yes.
What's up with that?
Yes.
So why do you think Dick Allen is writing a poem theoretically about cause and effect, when in fact, when we look at it and we say, what does a blue heron have to do with any of these things, we go, I don't know. Why do you think he did that?
Well, you know, Mr. Allen is a Buddhist, so that way of thinking kind of takes, by putting that in perspective, the title of the poem, Because a Blue Heron Flew Overhead, and he's just sort of talking about the day and just sort of the ebbs and the flows of the day, and a good day to ask a clock what makes it tick. He's just sort of appreciating being in the moment.
Very much so. And I love the line, the glory, the wonder, the sheer joy of names. So one of the things he's doing here is he's playing with words. He's playing with the sounds of words in a way that's extremely satisfying and almost childlike, which I love.
Very much so. He also repeats the word ripple right, one line and the second line, but he makes it work. That's something that I would never want to do in my own writing, but it just effortlessly works in his poem.
And I think that's my favorite couplet. To remember that if you think, there are ripples, but also if you don't think, there are ripples. Now, that also strikes me as being a metaphysical thought.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a connection between thinking and the natural world.
Yes.
And sometimes thinking doesn't get us very far. What do you think about the final two lines, the final couplet in the poem? What does that mean to you?
Oh, that's my favorite part, thread and unthread. We talked a little earlier about that is kind of how life is. You are going in a certain direction and then you're going in a different direction, and he's very aware of that. Mr. Allen was someone that read in my series, and it was a pleasure to meet him, and it was a pleasure to hear his reading. There was a few poems that were absolutely hysterical, and you would not expect humor from a man that does not look like he has a lot of humor in him.
True.
Yes.
Yes, that's something I love about him, that he does have that kind of delightfully childish wonder in the use of words. And I think this is just really a lovely poem. Yeah. I want to quickly go on to read Ozymandias, and the reason I'm reading this is because it's the only poem I remember from high school, like literally the only poem. There's a reason for this. It was written by Shelley in 1818. Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I think I loved this back when I was in high school because it spoke to me of people that wanted me to do things I didn't want to do. And yet, the poem written in 1818 speaks to me just as clearly today of the nature of power.
Yes.
What do you say?
Absolutely. I believe this poem may have been written as a metaphor for political power in England at the time of Percy's writing. But yes, we talked earlier about this one as well. and about the power of statues. Giant pieces of a statue just kind of, when someone just pushes it over, it still speaks to you because they're still so great.
I think that's fascinating. It reminds me of the destruction of the statues of the Buddha and the destruction of statues of Stalin. And, it has ever been so. And yet the power of words never dissipates.
Never.
Here we are reading something written in 1818. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about poetry, that it continues to have its, well, as Dick Allen says, its ripples.
That's right.
Yes, it continues to ripple throughout our lives today, and just reminding us that, yes, the more things change, the more they stay the same, I suppose.
That's so true. That's so true.
And I also am really intrigued by the fact that Shelley distanced himself in this poem by putting the words in the mouth of a traveler. So this is not actually Shelley or even an I narrator, although there is an I narrator in the poem. It's distanced in that it's in the words of a traveler from an antique land. And in a way, aren't we all travelers from an antique land?
We
when you
certainly
think about
are.
it? Yeah. So really happy to be able to share a little bit of poetry with you and to hear about some of your poetry doings and goings on. We will definitely look for your series. And to our viewers, we will be continuing this series. There'll be another one that will be coming up this season, and then we'll take a break for the month of August, and we'll be back again in September. These shows I'm also going to post up on my website. So if you look at www.christinebeck.net, you will see links to this show and also to the ones that have gone before. As always, if you have comments, the things you'd like to see me do that I haven't done, other than not talk about poetry, which I can't help, please send them to me. You can contact me through my website, and I would love to hear from you, our West Hartford citizens and citizens from beyond, because we really do want to bring the love and joy of the reading and writing of poetry to you. So thank you very much for being with me. And Katie, thank you again for taking some time to let us know what you've been up to in the poetry world. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.